grounded theory approach in qualitative research.
Kapag naririnig natin ang salitang theory, usually naiisip natin na meron na siyang existing idea na kailangan nating patunayan or pag-aralan. Pero paano kung baliktad? Paano kung magsimula muna tayo sa mga actual experiences ng mga tao, hanapin natin ang common patterns at saka tayo bumuo ng explanation and theory. That is the basic idea of grounded theory approach. Hi! This is Maria Clarissa Margaret Iranas, and today, pag-uusapan natin kung ano nga ba ang grounded theory approach in qualitative research. Explain natin to in a simple and practical way para mas madali natin siyang maintindihan kung ano ito, paano to ginagawa, at kailan to ginagamit. So, let's get started! Grounded theory is an important approach in qualitative research that help us understand people's experiences, actions, interactions, and social processes. Unlike research approaches that starts with an existing theory and then test it, grounded theory starts with the data gathered from the participants. From those data, researchers look for patterns, develop categories, and eventually build possible explanations or theories. So, if I were to explain it in one simple sentence, in grounded theory, we let the data help us discover the theory. Did you know that grounded theory was developed by Barney Glaser and Alston Strauss? They introduced the methodology in their 1967 book, The Discovery of Grounded Theory. Since then, grounded theory has developed into different approaches, including classic or Glaserian, Straussian, and constructivist grounded theory. Even though these approaches have differences, they all focus on developing theoretical understanding that is connected to actual data. Grounded theory is also useful in education. For example, we might want to know, how do teachers adjust when a new curriculum is introduced? Or how do students deal with academic challenges? Instead of deciding the answer beforehand, we'll listen to the participants and allow their experiences to guide the research. And that brings us to our main discussion. Understanding grounded theory. So what exactly is grounded theory? Grounded theory is an inductive qualitative research methodology. In simple terms, we start with the data. And from the data, we develop ideas and possible explanations. One important thing to remember is that data collection and analysis happen together. Researchers don't simply collect all the information first and analyze everything at the end. Instead, they start analyzing the early data while the research is still happening. For example, Imagine that I am interviewing teachers about their experiences with a new curriculum. After interviewing the first few teachers, I noticed that many of them mentioned difficulty adjusting to new requirements. That finding may influence the next interviews. I might ask more questions about adjustment, time management, or support from the school. So, the research keeps moving between collecting data, analyzing, comparing, collecting more data, and analyzing again. There are several important characteristics of grounded theory. First, it is the data-driven inductive. This means that instead of starting with fixed categories, the researcher looks at the actual data and identifies ideas, patterns, and relationships that come from the participants' experiences. This is where coding becomes important. So, when do we use grounded theory? Grounded theory is useful when we want to understand a process, experience, or interaction that is not yet well understood. For example, let's say we want to study how do senior high school teachers adjust to a new curriculum. We could interview teachers, study their experiences, compare their answers, and conduct additional interviews based on what we discover. Eventually, we may develop an explanation of how teachers move through different stages of adjustment. The important point here is that grounded theory is not simply about describing what happened. It aims to explain how or why a process happens. So, if our research question is asking about the process behind an experience, grounded theory may be a good choice. Okay, so what are the major approaches to grounded theory? Grounded theory has three commonly discussed approaches. Classic or Glazerian, Straussian, and constructivist grounded theory. Let's briefly look at each one. First, classic or Glazerian grounded theory. This approach is associated with Barney Glaser. It focuses on allowing the theory to develop naturally from the data. The researcher avoids forcing the data into fixed categories and instead looks for common ideas and patterns. Second, Straussian grounded theory. So this approach is associated with Anselm Strauss and Juliet Corbin. It provides a more structured way of analyzing data and commonly uses open, actual, and selective coding. So basically, open coding identify important ideas. Actual coding connect related ideas. Selective coding identify the main idea or category. Third, constructivist grounded theory. So this approach is associated with Katie Charmas. It recognizes that both researcher and the participants contribute to the construction of meaning. In other words, the researcher is not completely separate from the research process. The researcher's perspective and the social context can also influence how the data are understood. So, grounded theory is not just one rigid method. Researchers need to choose the approach that best fits their research purpose and perspective. Another important part of grounded theory is the constant comparative method. This simply means that the researcher continuously compares new information with the data and categories that have already been collected. For example, let's say several teachers are talking about their experiences with a new curriculum. The researcher compares their answers. Are their experience similar? Are there differences? What patterns are appearing? Maybe one teacher says the main problem is workload, while another says the problem is lack of training. The researcher compares these responses instead of simply putting everything under one label. New information may also add to or change an existing categories. The goal is to make sure that the findings are based on the actual data and not simply on the researcher's assumptions. So, in simple terms, constant comparison helps us check and improve our findings as the research continues. So, what makes the grounded theory useful? One major strength is that it is closely connected to real-life experiences. The theory does not simply come from assumptions. It develops from the actual experiences and data gathered from participants. Another strength is that it can help researchers develop new ideas and patterns that they might not have expected at the beginning. Of course, grounded theory also has limitations. First, it can be time-consuming. Because data collection and analysis happen together, the researcher may need several rounds of interviews, coding, comparison, and analysis. Second, it requires strong qualitative research skills. The researcher needs to recognize patterns without forcing personal assumptions into the data. Third, there is a possible risk of researcher bias because the researcher is actively involved in interpreting the data. Personal experiences and perspectives can influence the findings. And lastly, because grounded theory is flexible, the research can sometimes become too broad. Now, let's connect everything to education. Grounded theory can be useful in educational research because teaching and learning involve complex human experiences. Teachers, students, administrators and other stakeholders may experience the same situation in very different ways. For example, we could study how do beginning teachers develop classroom management strategies during their first year. We could interview beginning teachers, observe their experiences, compare the data, and look for patterns. Maybe we discovered that teachers initially struggle with classroom management, then seek advice from colleagues, try different strategies, and eventually develop their own approach. From these experiences, we may develop a theory that explains how beginning teachers gradually build confidence and improve their classroom management. For me, this shows why grounded theory can be meaningful in education. It does not simply ask, what happened? It also asks, how did it happen? And what can we learn from that process? So, to summarize, grounded theory is a qualitative research approach that develops ideas or explanations from the actual data and experiences. We learn